Someone is deeply, almost uncontrollably in love with you, and the reason behind it may not comfort you the way you expect. In fact, it might disturb you more than it flatters you, because it has very little to do with the image you carry of yourself. It has much more to do with what you unintentionally activated inside them. And once this becomes clear, it is not something that can be unseen again. It stays in awareness, quietly changing how everything is understood. You may have grown up believing that love is built on simple foundations like attraction, shared interests, timing, or emotional compatibility. That belief feels safe, structured, and easy to accept. But comfort does not always reflect truth.
The human mind often chooses explanations that reduce emotional complexity, even when reality is far more layered. Real love, especially the kind that feels intense, consuming, and difficult to control, does not originate only from logic. It grows in deeper layers of the mind, where awareness is limited and emotional patterns are formed long before understanding catches up. Without realizing it, you entered a space within someone's inner world that had been carefully protected for a long time. Not because you forced your way in, but because something about your presence bypassed their usual emotional defenses. You did not arrive as a threat, yet something in them reacted as if you were significant in a way they could not immediately explain. And that is where things begin to shift.
You did not simply make them feel liked or appreciated. That would have been easy for their mind to process and store as a normal experience. Instead, you made them feel seen, not in a surface-level way, but in a deeper, quieter sense that touches parts of a person they usually keep hidden, even from themselves. This kind of feeling is powerful because it bypasses control, and when control weakens, attachment begins to form in ways that are not fully conscious. Most people misunderstand this stage. They assume that strong emotional attachment is the same as simple affection, but what is happening here is more complex. You triggered recognition inside them, a sense that something within them has been noticed without permission. That recognition is not always pleasant. It can feel exposing. It can feel like something internal has been gently uncovered and is now no longer fully private.
And because of that, you became more than just a person in their life. You became a reflection, not because you tried to be one, and not because you acted in a particular way, but because their mind started using your presence as a surface to project unspoken thoughts, emotions, and unresolved inner material. This is not a conscious process.
It happens automatically when someone encounters feelings they do not have language for. Their internal structure, the mental framework that usually keeps emotions organized and predictable, starts to lose its usual stability around you. That structure is normally designed to filter experiences, to decide what is safe to feel and what should remain buried. But your presence disrupted that filtering process. It is not that you broke it forcefully. It is more accurate to say that it stopped functioning the same way when you were involved. This is where emotional confusion begins to grow. What they feel is no longer simple or easy to label. It becomes layered with attraction, curiosity, vulnerability, uncertainty, and sometimes even fear. These emotions do not separate cleanly. They overlap, they mix, and in that mixture intensity is created. But intensity does not always mean clarity. Sometimes it is the opposite.
You did not follow a predictable emotional pattern for them.
You did not fit neatly into the expectations their mind usually uses to categorize people, and the human brain relies heavily on patterns. Patterns create comfort because they allow prediction. When something cannot be easily predicted, the mind becomes highly alert. Attention increases. Emotional focus strengthens. The person becomes more mentally attached, even without intending to be. So you became unpredictable in a way that felt meaningful rather than random. Not chaotic, but layered with emotional weight they could not easily decode. And when something feels meaningful but unclear, the mind often tries to solve it by giving it importance. It begins to assign significance beyond what is logically present. This is where projection deepens. They stop seeing only who you are in a literal sense and begin to interpret you through their internal emotional needs.
You become associated with ideas, possibilities, and emotional states that already existed within them before you appeared. In a way, you become an answer, but not to a question they consciously asked. More like an answer to something unspoken, something emotionally present but never clearly defined.
Once that shift happens, emotional attachment strengthens in a different direction. It is no longer only about who you are as a person in daily reality. It becomes about what you represent inside their inner world. And that representation is shaped more by their inner state than by your actual actions. At this stage, detachment becomes difficult. Not because the connection is necessarily balanced or stable, but because letting go of you would also mean confronting the internal material that surfaced through you. And the mind naturally resists that kind of confrontation. It prefers attachment, even if that attachment creates confusion, because confusion still feels easier than emotional emptiness or internal uncertainty. So they hold on in different ways. Sometimes through attention, sometimes through emotional sensitivity, sometimes through silence that still feels charged with meaning.
Pause. Even when nothing explicit is happening, something underneath continues to move. You can sense it in subtle reactions, in pauses, in the way responses carry more weight than the situation seems to justify.
But what is important to understand is that this intensity is not fully conscious. They are not fully aware of the depth or structure of what is happening inside them. Much of it exists beneath awareness, where thoughts are not clearly formed and emotions do not have direct names. It is a space where contradiction can exist without resolution, where affection and fear can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. And that is what makes it so complex. Because when emotions are not fully conscious, they do not behave in stable ways. They shift, they amplify. They create internal tension that the person cannot easily explain, even to themselves. They may try to rationalize it, but rational explanations often feel incomplete because they do not reach the actual source. And you may have already noticed this in subtle ways. In the way their attention feels slightly different around you.
In the way silence can feel charged. In the way even ordinary interactions can carry emotional depth that seems larger than the moment itself. These are signs of internal processing that is happening beneath spoken words.
What makes this even more complex is that they are also responding to parts of themselves they were not previously in contact with. You acted as a trigger, not in a deliberate way, but in a psychological sense. Something dormant became active. Something unspoken became emotionally present. And once something inside a person becomes active, it naturally seeks resolution or expression, even if the person does not fully understand what it is. So what they feel is not a single emotion. It is a layered experience. Attraction mixed with uncertainty. Curiosity mixed with emotional exposure. Desire mixed with hesitation. And underneath all of that, a deeper recognition that something internal has changed in a way that cannot easily be reversed. This is why the connection feels different.
Not because it follows a known pattern, but because it does not fully belong to any simple category. It exists in a space between understanding and confusion, between awareness and the unconscious, between what is felt and what can be explained. And once someone experiences that kind of internal shift, they rarely return to their previous emotional state in the same way again. And that is why their behavior feels inconsistent. One moment they appear fully drawn toward you, almost unable to hold back their attention. In the next moment, they suddenly withdraw, become distant, or act like nothing has changed.
This shift is not necessarily because their feelings disappeared or changed into something else, but because their internal defenses were activated. Something inside them registered the intensity of what they are feeling as risky, unfamiliar, or emotionally exposing. A part of them begins to sense that this connection is revealing layers they normally keep hidden, and that awareness creates internal resistance. This is how a push and pull pattern begins to form without conscious intention. Desire pulls them closer, while fear pushes them away. The need for closeness rises, and then hesitation follows right after it. Intensity builds, and then confusion appears to balance it. Over time, this becomes a repeating cycle that neither side fully controls. And you are part of this dynamic whether you actively realize it or not, because a part of you can sense it too. You may notice that something about this connection feels heavier than normal interactions.
It does not sit in the mind lightly. It feels charged, emotionally layered, and difficult to ignore, almost as if it is drawing something out of you as well, not just out of them.
This raises an important question. What exactly happened between you and them that created this level of intensity? Because from this perspective, it does not appear random. It does not feel like simple coincidence. And it does not align with something purely accidental either. Instead, it feels like there was a moment, a very specific internal moment, where something shifted in their perception. In that moment, something inside them recognized you in a way that was deeper than surface-level interaction. It was not just about appearance, behavior, or timing. It was an internal recognition, something that happens beneath conscious thought. And once that recognition occurs, it often creates a sense that things cannot simply return to how they were before. But this is the part most people fail to understand. That recognition is not truly about who you are in an external or visible sense.
It is about what you represent inside their internal world. In their unconscious mind, you become associated with something meaningful, something unresolved, or something emotionally charged that already existed within them.
And what you represent can be complex. It may be something they have been searching for without knowing it. It may also be something they have been avoiding for a long time. In many cases, it can be both at the same time. A desire they suppressed, a feeling they denied, or a need they learned to ignore can suddenly become active again through this connection. Until this is understood, the intensity of their behavior will continue to feel confusing. Because the mind tries to explain emotional reactions in simple terms, but what is happening here is not simple at all. It is layered, internal, and largely unconscious. In a deeper sense, what seems like falling in love is not always a straightforward emotional process. Sometimes it is the activation of something already stored within the mind, something that was dormant until a trigger brought it back into awareness.
Sighs. When that happens, the emotional response can feel overwhelming because it is not entirely new. It is something familiar that has returned after being buried. This is why they cannot easily let go, and why the connection feels so persistent even when there is distance, because what has been activated inside them does not simply disappear when ignored. It continues to exist in the background, influencing thoughts, reactions, and emotional states.
Over time, they may try to convince themselves that what they feel is temporary. They may label it as passing attraction, curiosity, or emotional confusion. At first, this explanation feels comforting because it reduces the intensity of what they are experiencing. But as time passes, that explanation becomes harder to maintain. Instead of fading, the feeling often strengthens. It becomes more present in their thoughts, more active in their memory, and more difficult to ignore in quiet moments. This happens because emotional material that is deeply rooted in the unconscious does not weaken easily with time alone. In some cases, time actually deepens the internal processing of it. The unconscious mind does not operate like conscious reasoning. It does not forget experiences in the same way. It stores emotional impressions, unresolved reactions, and significant encounters.
And it keeps them until something brings them forward again. When that happens, the emotional charge returns with it.
And somehow, in this situation, that role becomes connected to you. Not necessarily because of anything deliberate you did, but because your presence became linked to something already active within them. You became a trigger point for internal material that was waiting for expression. At this stage, it becomes important to understand that your role is not simply external. You are not just a person interacting with another person in a straightforward way. In their internal experience, you take on symbolic meaning. You represent something that carries emotional weight beyond the surface-level identity. This is why the intensity feels disproportionate at times. It is not always about present moments. It is also about what is being projected onto you from within them. The mind often uses external figures as carriers for internal emotional content. When this happens, the person becomes more than themselves in the perception of the other. And because of this projection, the emotional response becomes stronger and more complex. They are not only reacting to who you are in reality, but also to what you symbolize in their internal world. This is where confusion often begins, because the conscious mind sees one thing, while the unconscious mind experiences something deeper. This also explains why inconsistency appears. One part of them moves closer because it is drawn to what has been activated inside. Another part pulls away because it recognizes the emotional risk involved in staying that close. It is not necessarily confusion about you as a person, but conflict within themselves. And that internal conflict does not remain silent. It expresses itself through behavior, through hesitation, delayed responses, sudden withdrawal, or emotional distance after moments of closeness. These patterns are not random. They are expressions of internal imbalance. You may also notice that you can feel this shift without being told. That sense of change in tone, energy, or emotional availability is often noticeable even without direct communication. This is because human connection is not experienced only through words, but also through emotional signals that are felt and interpreted unconsciously. At times, you might even question what exactly you did to cause such a strong reaction. The answer is not always visible in actions. Instead, it exists in the way your presence interacts with something already present inside them. You did not create the entire emotional response from nothing. You activated something that was already there. And that activation point becomes a turning moment. Because once an internal emotional structure is activated, it does not easily return to its previous inactive state. It continues to develop, change, and influence perception. This is the connection begins to feel like it has a life of its own. It grows through thought, memory, and emotional repetition. Even in silence, it continues to exist in their internal experience. And silence does not reduce it, it often amplifies it. As this continues, their mind may begin to revisit interactions repeatedly. Conversations are replayed, moments are analyzed, and small details are examined more than they normally would be. This is not always intentional. It often happens automatically because the mind is trying to make sense of something emotionally unresolved. The stronger the emotional charge, the more persistent this mental replay becomes. Not because they want confusion, but because the mind seeks resolution when something remains incomplete. And incomplete emotional patterns are powerful. They do not settle easily.
They remain active until they are understood, expressed, or resolved in some form. Until then, they continue to influence thought and behavior from behind the scenes.
This is also where the intensity you feel becomes more understandable, because what you are experiencing is not just a simple interaction. It is a combination of present reality, internal projection, emotional memory, and unconscious activation all layered together. And in that layered experience, meaning begins to form that goes beyond simple attraction or dislike. It becomes something that feels significant, hard to ignore, and emotionally charged in ways that are not easy to describe. At this point, distance between you does not necessarily weaken the connection. In some cases, it changes how the mind processes it. Absence removes direct confirmation from reality and replaces it with imagination. And imagination has no fixed limits. Within imagination, thoughts expand, emotions intensify, scenarios become more detailed and more emotionally meaningful than simple real-time interaction. This is why distance can sometimes increase internal attachment rather than reduce it. Because now, instead of dealing with reality directly, the mind interacts with internal images and interpretations. And those internal versions are often shaped by emotion rather than facts alone. Over time, this creates a stronger internal presence of you within their mind, not weaker. You become more than a person in their environment. You become a mental and emotional reference point, something they return to repeatedly in thought. And this is where resistance begins to grow again. Because the stronger the internal presence becomes, the more the conscious mind tries to regain control. It introduces doubt, logic, and caution as protective mechanisms. Not because the feeling is absent, but because its intensity feels difficult to manage. The mind tries to balance emotional force with rational explanation, even when both are not fully aligned. This internal balancing act creates tension, and that tension cannot remain stable forever. It continues building until something shifts, either internally or externally. Because eventually the human mind reaches a point where holding two opposing emotional forces becomes unsustainable. One side seeks closeness, while the other seeks distance. One seeks expression, while the other seeks control. And over time, something has to give way. When that shift happens, it may appear in different forms. Sometimes it becomes emotional expression, sometimes withdrawal, sometimes confusion that turns into action, and sometimes it becomes a sudden decision that seems unexpected from the outside. Because when unconscious processes dominate, conscious logic is no longer the primary driver of behavior. Emotional pressure becomes stronger than reasoning. And that is the point where everything changes again, not because the connection ends, but because it reaches a stage where it demands some form of resolution, whether through understanding, separation, or acceptance. And at the center of it all remains one simple reality.
What was activated inside them is not easily dismissed. It does not fade just because it is ignored. It continues to exist, influencing perception, memory, and emotional response. The only uncertainty is not whether it exists, but how they will eventually respond to it, and what they will choose when they can no longer stay in the middle of that internal conflict.